Gentlemen, the
joke landed
situation
like a
requires
slap.
immediate and decisive
Laughter
action. We must
followed.
coordinate our efforts
Medals
across
gleamed
all
under
units to
bright
address the
lights while
emerging
one
threats
woman
effectively.
stayed still, hands flat on cold steel. No one expected her answer. No one expected silence to carry more weight than rank. But some truths don't shout. They end rooms. The conference room sat high in the building, sealed off from daylight, thick walls, frosted glass, a long table that reflected faces without warmth. This was where careers bent or broke quietly. Flags stood stiff in the corners, their colors muted under white lights that hummed without mercy. Chairs were arranged with precision, each one already claiming its authority. Sergeant Lena Cross sat near the far end, posture straight, shoulders relaxed in the way only long training can teach. Her uniform was clean, correct, unremarkable. No excess ribbons, no flash. Her hands rested calmly on a legal pad she didn't plan to use. She knew better than to write when words could be misread later. Across from her sat Major General Thomas Ridley. Broad shoulders, easy confident, the kind of man who filled rooms without trying. He had already skimmed her file twice, more for show than curiosity. To him, the answers were obvious before the questions formed. Around them, officers whispered lightly, polite smiles trading places with judgment. Lena felt it in the air, that familiar pressure, not fear, expectation. The kind that asks you to prove something you were never allowed to explain. Ridley leaned back, folding his hands over his chest. His voice carried easily. "So," he said, smiling, "let's talk about your kill count." A ripple of laughter followed. Quick, controlled, professional. Lena didn't react, not because she was numb, but because she knew the room was watching for any crack. And she had learned long ago that silence, when held right, could be louder than defense. Lena Cross didn't look like anyone's idea of a legend. She was average height, moved without urgency, and spoke only when necessary. If you passed her in a hallway, you'd think she belonged to supply or admin or somewhere quiet and forgettable. That assumption had followed her for years, and she let it. She grew up in a small coastal town where storms came fast and apologies came slow. Her father fixed boats with hands scarred by salt and time. Her mother worked nights at a diner and slept in short stretches. In that house, you learned early not to ask for attention. You earned space by being useful. When Lena enlisted, it wasn't about glory. It was about order, about knowing where to stand and what was expected. Boot camp stripped her down and rebuilt her piece by piece. She learned discipline the hard way, learned that pain fades but habits stay. She wasn't the loudest, she wasn't the strongest, but she listened. She watched. She remembered details others ignored. Instructors noticed but never praised it openly. Quiet skills were valuable but not celebrated. Her record reflected that same understatement. Solid marks, reliable, calm, pages filled with careful language that revealed nothing and hid everything. Assignments listed without stories, gaps without explanation, entire sections redacted into blank space. To many officers, that kind of file looked suspicious. Like protection, like favoritism, they didn't see discipline, they saw absence. Lena felt their eyes skim past her humanity and land only on the paper. She had learned to live inside that gap, to carry experiences that couldn't be shared and losses that couldn't be named. And today, in this room, she knew they weren't here to understand her. They were here to measure her worth by what she was allowed to say. General Ridley tapped the folder again, smiling as if the moment was light. "Relax," he said, glancing around the room. "We're all professionals here." Lena watched his fingers. Steady, confident, a man used to rooms agreeing with him. "You've been attached to several operations," he continued. "Some kinetic, some not. Records are vague." He looked up. "People are curious." "Curious?" The word slid neatly over the edge of accusation. "After all," he added, "numbers matter to some people." He paused. "So, how many?" A few officers chuckled again. Someone leaned back, arms crossed. Another adjusted a pen. Lena felt heat rise in her chest, not anger, but something older. The echo of names, of faces that never made it home, of moments reduced to statistics by people who slept through the night. She didn't answer. She kept her gaze level, eyes calm. Ridley raised an eyebrow. "No answer." "I don't keep count," she said finally. Her voice was even. That earned another laugh, sharper this time. Ridley shook his head. "That's convenient." The room leaned in. The joke had turned. It always did. "You see," he went on, "we're trying to determine impact, effectiveness." He smiled again. "And humor helps break tension." Lena understood then. This wasn't about clarity, it was about control, about reminding her where she stood. She pressed her fingertips lightly against the table, grounding herself. She could hear her own breath. In, out, the silence stretched just long enough to make people uncomfortable. Ridley leaned forward. "Surely you can give us something." Lena met his eyes, and for the first time she let the room feel her presence, not through words, but through stillness that refused to bend. Lena had learned early that truth isn't always allowed to speak. Some missions existed only in fragments. Some actions lived in classified shadows where even memory had to be careful. She had signed papers that followed her into sleep, agreements that outlived the people they protected. There were nights overseas where the air tasted like dust and metal, where radios crackled with half-sentences, where decisions were made in seconds and consequences lasted forever. She remembered one village at dawn, the quiet after chaos, the sound of a child crying somewhere unseen. She remembered carrying weight that wasn't hers alone. None of that lived in her file. None of it could. Back in the room, Ridley flipped another page. "Your evaluations are restrained," he said. "No glowing praise, no criticism." He smiled thinly, almost invisible. Lena nodded once. "I did my job." "Did you?" he asked. The question hung heavy. She thought of a teammate who didn't come back, of standing at a memorial where names were carved too small to hold the grief behind them, of letters written and rewritten, then never sent because there were no right words. "Yes," she said quietly. Ridley leaned back again. "Some might say you were protected. Others might say you were unnecessary." A murmur passed through the room. Lena felt the line tightening. She could defend herself. She could explain roles, contexts, outcomes, but every sentence risked crossing boundaries drawn in invisible ink, so she chose restraint. "I followed orders," she said. Ridley sighed, exaggerated. "That's not leadership." Lena didn't flinch. She had seen leadership in whispered commands under fire, in hands pulling others to safety, in silence chosen to protect those who couldn't speak. This room measured leadership differently, by volume, by certainty, by spectacle. She realized then that this wasn't her trial alone. It was a test of whether quiet service had a place left in a world that demanded proof in numbers and jokes to soften cruelty. The questions came faster after that. Dates, locations, units, overlapping timelines, each one framed as confusion but delivered like accusation. "How did you end up attached to Naval Command here? Why were you reassigned without documentation? Who approved this clearance?" Lena answered what she could, short, precise, respectful. The room filled the rest with its own conclusions. A colonel scribbled notes without looking up. A civilian advisor whispered to the person beside her. Someone sighed loudly as if patience were running out. Ridley watched it all with ease. He let the tension grow. He enjoyed the imbalance. "You see," he said finally, "from where we sit, this looks like someone slipping through cracks." Lena folded her hands together. She thought of the cracks she'd been sent into. Places where visibility was a liability, where anonymity kept people alive. "I was placed where needed," she said. "And who decided that?" She paused. The boundary flared bright. "I can't disclose that." Ridley nodded, satisfied. "Of course you can't." The room took that as confirmation. Lena felt the familiar loneliness settle in, the kind that comes when truth stands alone without witnesses. She remembered a senior operator once telling her, "If you do it right, no one will ever know." At the time, she thought it was a compliment. Now it felt like a sentence. Ridley closed the folder. "Well," he said, standing slightly, "without transparency, it's hard to justify advancement." That was the cliff edge. Lena inhaled slowly. She understood what was being decided, not because she failed, but because she couldn't perform her pain for their comfort. She lifted her gaze, and when she spoke again, it wasn't defense. It was something else entirely. "I don't keep a kill count," Lena said, her voice steady, "because I don't measure my service by what I take." The room quieted, not completely, but enough. Ridley tilted his head. "Then how do you measure it?" She didn't answer right away. She looked down at her hands, then back up. When she spoke, her words were simple, careful. "By who made it home," she said. No one laughed. "I measure it by the people who walked away," she continued. "By the ones who slept another night because something didn't happen." Ridley's smile faded. Lena kept going, not louder but clearer. The things I'm proud of don't show up in numbers. They show up in empty chairs that stayed empty because plans worked. A shift moved through the room. Someone straightened, someone else stopped writing. I was trained to prevent outcomes, she said, not advertise them. The silence deepened. Ridley cleared his throat. That's poetic, he said, but the word lacked humor now. It's honest, Lena replied. She felt it then, the weight lifting slightly. Not because they agreed, but because she had spoken without breaking faith with those she protected. For the first time, the room didn't feel like it was leaning against her. It felt uncertain. Ridley sat back down slowly. He glanced at the folder, then at her. And in that pause, something cracked, not in her composure, but in their certainty. The joke had lost its power, and silence, once used against her, now belonged to her. No one spoke for several seconds. The hum of the lights grew louder, or maybe everyone just noticed it for the first time. Lena stayed still. She didn't press. She didn't explain further. Finally, a Navy captain near the end of the table shifted. You're saying your role was preventative, he said, not unkindly. Lena nodded once. Ridley frowned. That's still vague. It has to be, she replied. She saw something flicker in a few faces. Recognition, not full understanding, but respect beginning to form. A woman in civilian attire spoke up quietly. Some of those assignments, they align with interagency disruption efforts. Ridley shot her a look. She stopped, but the door was open now, just a crack. Lena remembered a night in a desert operations center, watching feeds that showed too much and too little at once, remembered a call made at the last second, a convoy rerouted, an explosion that never happened, no headlines, no medals, just relief that no families would get a knock at the door. That was her work. Ridley exhaled. You understand how this looks, he said. Yes, Lena answered. And you're comfortable with that? She thought of the faces she carried with her, of promises kept quietly. Yes, she said again. The room sat with it. Ridley leaned forward, slower this time. You don't deny force was used. No, but you don't celebrate it. No, why? Lena met his eyes. Because it isn't a joke. The words landed clean. No anger, no accusation, just truth. Something shifted then, not dramatically but deeply. The kind of shift that doesn't announce itself. The kind that lingers. Ridley closed the folder again. This time he didn't tap it. Ridley leaned back, staring at the ceiling for a moment longer than necessary. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Less performative, more human. I lost a friend once, he said quietly, early in my career. No one interrupted. He didn't make it home, Ridley continued. We joked a lot back then. Dark humor, it helped us cope. He paused. Sometimes I forget where the line is. Lena listened without reacting. She had learned that confession doesn't require forgiveness to be heard. Ridley looked back at her. You remind me of him. The room held its breath. He never talked about what he did either, Ridley added. Said the same thing you did, that some successes look like nothing happened at all. Silence followed. Not heavy now, but reflective. Lena felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief, recognition. Ridley straightened. This board was prepared to make assumptions, he said, glancing around, perhaps too quickly. No one argued. A colonel cleared his throat. We may need to reconsider how we evaluate certain types of service. Lena kept her gaze forward. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She let the moment be what it was. Ridley turned back to her. Your restraint, he said, is noted. She inclined her head slightly. The power in the room had shifted, not because Lena demanded it, but because she refused to cheapen her truth to earn it. For the first time, she felt seen, not fully, but enough, and sometimes enough is everything. The meeting wrapped without ceremony, no dramatic vote, no apology spoken aloud. Papers were gathered, chairs moved. Conversations resumed in lower tones. Ridley stood as Lena did. You're dismissed, he said. She saluted. He returned it, proper, equal. As she turned to leave, a junior officer stepped aside to let her pass. His eyes held something new, respect without curiosity. In the hallway, the air felt different, lighter, not because she had won, but because she had not lost herself. She walked past framed photos of past leaders, all smiles and certainty. She wondered how many of them carried stories they never told, how many jokes hid grief too heavy to name. Outside, daylight hit her face. She paused for a moment, breathing it in. Her phone buzzed once. A simple message from an unknown number. Thank you for today. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Lena knew what she would carry forward. The same quiet commitment. The same refusal to reduce human cost to numbers. Somewhere behind her, the room would reset. Another file. Another judgment. But something had shifted there too. A crack in certainty. A pause before the next joke. And that mattered. She walked on, blending back into the world that would never know her full story. And that was okay, because the people who needed her had already felt her impact, even if they never learned her name. Weeks later, nothing about Lena's routine changed. She reported, she trained, she supported operations that would never make the news. The system didn't transform overnight. It rarely does, but she noticed small things, a question asked with more care, a joke left unfinished. A pause where there used to be laughter. Once, during a briefing, a senior officer referenced preventative outcomes with new respect. Lena didn't look up, but she heard it. She thought about how truth moves, not in speeches, but in moments, in rooms where silence finally gets heard. At night, she still dreamed of places half forgotten, of faces without names, but the dreams felt lighter now, less burdened by the need to justify. She understood something she hadn't before. That integrity doesn't need recognition to be real, but sometimes it needs one witness. Ridley became that witness, flawed and human as he was. Lena never told her family what happened in that room. She told them she was fine. That work was work, that she was safe. And in her own quiet way, she was, because she had learned the power of a calm answer, of refusing to turn pain into performance, of letting silence teach those who thought they already knew. Some stories don't end with applause, they end with understanding. And sometimes that's the bravest ending of all. Months later, that meeting became a quiet reference point, not a legend, not a story told loudly, but a moment remembered when conversations edged toward cruelty disguised as humor. Someone would say, "Remember Cross," and the room would shift just enough to change course. Lena never knew how often her name came up. She didn't need to. The impact was never meant for her ego. She continued serving with the same steady presence, still overlooked by those who measured worth by volume, still trusted by those who understood the value of restraint. One afternoon, a young enlisted woman approached her after training, hesitant, nervous. "Ma'am," she said, "I heard you once shut down a general without raising your voice." Lena studied her face. "That's not what happened," she replied gently. The woman smiled anyway. "It helped me," she said. Lena nodded once. That was enough. She realized then that leadership doesn't always come from command. Sometimes it comes from example, from choosing dignity when provoked, from answering cruelty with clarity. The room that once laughed learned something, not all at once, not completely, but enough to matter. And Lena carried on, as she always had, quietly shaping outcomes no one would ever celebrate. Because some heroes don't need their stories told. They just need the world to be a little kinder because they were there. Years later, when Lena eventually stepped away from service, there was no parade, just a handshake, a folder, a thank you that felt sincere. She packed lightly, left behind uniforms folded with care, took with her only what mattered. On her last day, she stood alone for a moment outside the building. She thought about the question that started it all. The joke, the count. She smiled faintly. She knew the answer had always been the same, not a number, not a list, but countless. Countless moments where things didn't happen, countless lives uninterrupted, countless futures allowed to continue quietly. That was her legacy, and as she walked away, she felt something rare and steady settle in her chest.